Before we get into the topic for today, I want to talk about something that's kind of extremely pertinent when we look at evolutionary studies and how different organisms on the planet evolve. We kind of know this notion that nothing really exists in isolation. And so many creatures on the planet kind of have these what we call co-evolutionary relationships, right? They've essentially evolved alongside one another. An example of this that we've talked about before is the arrival of fruit-bearing trees when primates evolved, right? So primates and fruit-bearing trees have kind of co-evolved alongside one another. We're actually seeing one type of co-evolutionary relationship today as we look at how the coronavirus goes around and spreads, right? That's another type of co-evolutionary relationship. Viruses and bacteria, particularly ones that use animals as hosts and things like that, those evolved alongside us, right? Alongside with things like parasites, right? They've evolved alongside humans and other animals, you know, throughout our evolutionary history, right? And as we change to try and combat those things, they change as well in kind of a response, right? So these things aren't really going to go away in terms of disappearing. It's not like there's going to be an eradication of all parasitic diseases and things like that. It's kind of just this constant balancing act of how do we kind of keep ourselves safe, you know, and be able to respond to any changes that diseases or parasites make. We're going to look at another example of co-evolutionary relationships that some of you might be familiar with. At least you might be familiar with the product that is the result of this co-evolutionary relationship. Right, so our co-evolutionary relationships are, in essence, if we were to define it, is two distinct life forms that evolve alongside one another to the point that each organism's survival is based on each other's survivability, right? So they utilize each other. These, you know, co-evolutionary species utilize one another in terms of their survival. So, what evidence do we really use to infer co-evolutionary relationships when we're looking at various species and their behaviors out in the wild? Essentially, insects are a really great way, and herbivores are a really great way to look at co-evolutionary relationships because we know that closely related groups of herbivores, in terms of taxonomy, feed on closely related host plants, right? So this really suggests that there's a long evolutionary history of interaction between these species. So if we look at an example of coevolution, we have the fig tree and the fig wasp, right? So fig trees could not actually exist without the fig wasp. The fig wasp is required for the tree to complete its reproductive cycle. So the fig tree is the exclusive source of food for the fig wasp, hence its name. And the fig tree is necessary as well for the fig wasp reproduction, right? So we see that both of these organisms are actually involved in each other's reproductive cycle. So fig trees themselves are an extremely ancient class of tree, an ancient species. They have an extremely long lifespan. Some of them can live up to a few thousand years. And they need that wasp in order to pollinate, right? And the figs themselves are not actually fruit, but flowers and seeds contained within a bulging stem. This is something known as inflorescence, right? So when you eat a fig, you're actually not eating a fruit. You're eating kind of the flower and the nectar and all of kind of the petals and things like that just haven't really bloomed. So in terms of the fig wasp, which you can see a little one in the picture here, they're not very large. So the females will burrow into the fruit and lay their eggs and then subsequently die. The fig reabsorbs the female's wasp body and uses it for nutrients for the actual plant as well. The male comes later and fertilizes the eggs, and then the larvae later hatch and consume a little bit of the fig innards. So when you look at the next couple photos, you're going to see kind of how the life cycle of this fig or these fig wasps occur. Basically, in essence, the female will burrow down inside of this area here and lay their eggs right around there. And then once they hatch, the larvae will eat a portion of the insides of the fig, and then once they kind of develop, they'll leave through the same exit hole and kind of go about looking for another fig to pollinate. So last time, getting to kind of our actual subject for the day, last time we talked about the kind of development of the hominins in Africa, right? Remember the kind of basic, at least the overall pattern that we see is that, at the end of that Miocene period, kind of working into the Pleistocene, the Miocene apes, due to that climate change, basically left Europe and came back to Africa. And out of those apes evolved a few different classes of hominins, right? These are bipedal creatures that walk on two legs, like our Australopithecines, right? And there's a whole bunch of those. Our Ardipithecus as well, if we go a little bit further back in time. And we even have a few others that we don't have a whole lot of evidence for, not a whole lot of fossil evidence at least. We have our Coelanthropus chadensis, as well as our Tuganensis, right? So just know that during that time, there were a whole bunch of different bipedal species generally walking around. Some of their timelines overlap, right? So at one point there was probably several different hominid species living in Africa at the same time, and out of one of those species comes our kind of the emergence of the genus Homo, right, which is what the genus that we belong to, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the earlier members of the genus Homo, like our Homo Habilis and our Homo Erectus. And then as we kind of move into our final lectures, we're going to start to discuss Homo neanderthalensis and then the development of early Homo sapiens. So the Pleistocene period starts at or around 2 million to 1.8 million years ago till about 10,000 years ago, that 10,000 years BC mark. Large areas of the world, over 30% of the landmass was covered in ice. And there were many climatic fluctuations that were occurring in different areas of the world, right? When you have these large ice sheets moving around, it changes weather patterns in different parts of the world, right? Homo erectus, the kind of member of our genus that first left Africa and began to travel to different parts of the world, appeared near the beginning of the Pleistocene and was extinct by the end of it, right? Fully modern humans were on the scene by 10,000 years BC. So one of the kind of great debates that we have in modern evolutionary studies and modern physical anthropology is, well, how did this process, or how did the genus Homo really pop up, right? For millions of years, these Australopithecines existed and these Ardipithecus existed, these two-legged creatures walking around Africa, but their brains were small. Barely the size of a modern chimpanzee, right? So definitely not capable of creating the technologies and culture that we see and the tools that we see coming out of the genus Homo. So what is it? What spurred the creation or the kind of development of our genus? Well, we have a few different researchers that have kind of proposed why the genus Homo developed, right? We have Darwin, who proposed that the human lineage evolved directly from the African apes. Haeckel proposed that the human lineage came from Asian apes like orangutan. And both of these arguments were really based on anatomy, but essentially neither one of them was really correct. I mean, Darwin was kind of close, but we really didn't evolve out, right? There was a divergence very, very close to when chimpanzees developed in the last common ancestor, right? So it's not like we evolved out of chimpanzees. That split was extraordinarily early. So the first Homo erectus fossils were found in 1891 by a gentleman named Eugene Dubois, and he was really taking a cue from Alfred Wallace. Remember, he was our kind of contemporary of Darwin that worked on the same, or came to the same kind of conclusions as Darwin independently. But he was Dubois was taking kind of a cue from Wallace, and he went specifically to the island of Java to look for ancestors and found a very primitive human skull cap, right? He named it Pithecanthropus Erectus or erect ape man, but today we now call it Homo erectus, right? And we know that they are about 1 million years old, at least the specimens on Java. It was extremely controversial at the time because European scholars believed that an ancestor to humans would have had a bigger brain than the specimen that Dubois found. So one of the kind of questions that was very pervasive at the turn of the 20th century was why wasn't there really a whole lot of human fossils or a whole lot of ancient human fossils in the United States, right? We find a whole lot of ancient primate fossils, but we really don't find any ancient human ancestors. Well, don't worry about that because, well, we manufactured our own, or we're so, in essence, so excited to try and get fossils to, claim as our own that we really didn't do adequate study. Henry Osborn in 1922, he was an American geologist, claimed to find a Pithecanthropus erectus in Nebraska. This was based off of some fossil molar teeth that was found, and it turns out after extensive comparative zoology, they found out that it wasn't really an ancient human, it was, or even a human ancestor, it turned out to be the molars for an extinct pig. So this is just showing you what human molars are supposed to look like. And this is showing you what pig molars look like. So the kind of question is how did Henry Fairfield Osborn really kind of make that mistake? But it happened, so it's kind of interesting. But no, we don't have any ancient human fossils in North America, right? Because humans really didn't kind of come back, or really didn't come to America until around 20,000 years ago, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit later on in one of the later recorded lectures. So if we look at some of the differences that we see in those earlier Australopithecines that we talked about versus the genus Homo, if we look at an Australopithecine, starting out here, there's the presence of that sagittal crest at the top of the skull, which anchors very large chewing muscles, and it really reflects the genus's diet of very, very hard nuts and seeds and rooty vegetables, right? The large premolars and molars enabled Australopithecines to grind those hard nuts and seeds, right? So this is why we really think that megadontia, or those very enlarged back teeth, occurred. In the genus Homo, on the other hand, we see that we have a lack of a sagittal crest, which indicates that our chewing muscles were much, much smaller. As a matter of fact, the temporalis muscle, which used to in Australopithecines anchor to the sagittal crest, now in the genus Homo actually anchors to the side of the skull. You can feel that on the side of your skull. If you actually run your fingers up the side of your skull, you'll feel a little kind of ridge almost towards the top, right? That's where that muscle anchors. It indicates that the species, or the genus Homo, had smaller chewing muscles and a much softer diet. And we had much smaller molars and thinner enamel, right? Reflecting a softer diet as well. So first we'll start talking about the first member of the genus Homo in Africa, which was a species named Homo habilis, or roughly translates to the handyman, because he is our first toolmaker, our first scientifically recognized toolmaker, making that class of tools we talked about called Oldowan tools. So Homo habilis, in essence, is the first in the Homo lineage, right, and first of our genus. He's a possible descendant of Australopithecus garhi. We don't really know, based on similarity in the teeth and frontal skull features, but he was also living at the same time as late Australopithecines. So he was actually, Homo habilis was existing at the same time as Australopithecus garhi, right? So they're kind of timelines overlap a little bit. It had a similar bow plan to Australopithecines in that it had shorter legs and longer arms. This is just showing you some of our Homo habilis specimens here. And what you can really notice about Homo habilis over the earlier Australopithecines is that you see an expansion in the brain case here, right? You start to see that this area here is becoming taller, right, as opposed to the Australopithecines where it just kind of sloped back, right? So you're starting to see actual brain expansion, and this is where we start to see kind of the reduction in the size of those molars as well. So Homo habilis, in essence, was our first confirmed member of our kind of family lineage that had more reliance on tool use, right? So more tools allows for a greater diversity in diet. And this greater diversity in diet may have actually led to that smaller dentition and a smaller chewing complex, right? And there, of course, is expanded brain size over previous Australopithecine species. So Homo habilis created our kind of earliest stone tools, our oldest, what we call stone tool industry, known as Oldowan tools, and we'll take we'll look at a couple pictures of them. The earliest tools were made out of a variety of granitic rocks, flints, and cherts. And the primary function of early tools was not really to hunt, right? We weren't hunting at this point. We were using them to smash open bones or scrape flesh off of creatures that had already died. So essentially, we were scavengers. It's very likely that these kind of Homo habilises would either scavenge the landscape looking for recent kills from large predatory animals, or they would follow those large predatory animals and wait for them to kill, and then try and chase the predatory animal off in order to kind of get at the fresh kill. So our Homo habilis exists from around 3.0 million years to 2.0 million years ago. But the specimen that was really kind of the kind of most important in terms of the development of our genus and our species in general is a member of our species called Homo, or a member of our genus called Homo erectus. I like to refer to him as the world traveler, right? Because he's the first member of our genus to leave Africa and start traveling to other parts of the world. Remember, this is the specimen that was kind of, or the species that was found by Eugene Dubois on the island of Java, right? So they made it far outside of Africa. They pop up around 2.0 million years ago and last all the way until about 30,000 years ago, right? So they have a pretty long time range. So they're the first to have shorter arms than legs. This is one of the first species, and this is why we say that Homo erectus is the first member of our genus that most likely was capable of the type of running and the same type of walking that we as modern humans do, right? They had an identical gait cycle, right? And this is just a fancy way for saying, the different stages of how we walk, right? And in Homo erectus, it's identical to that of modern humans, right? We can see that in the lleret fossil footprints. So this is just showing you the basic migratory path of Homo erectus, right? So they made it all the way out into the Middle East through that kind of Middle Eastern travel corridor. They've made it into places in Western Africa, as well as into Europe, as well as into Southeast Asia, and all the way up into China, right? There's specimens that we find all over the world. So as we move through all of the rest of the textbook here, we're going to kind of get into this debate of lumping versus splitting here, right? And if we look at these different, and it's really interesting because the reason why we have this debate, or the reason why lumping versus splitting exists as kind of a taxonomic issue, is because, well, when you find a new species, it tends to be a little bit more exciting than when you're just finding another variation of the same species, right? So you're more likely to get research funding if you find a new species as opposed to just finding a different version of one that we already know of. So people are kind of maybe even unconsciously more willing to kind of look for any difference that can be used to justify creating a new species, right? And I think this is what happened a lot when we look at the genus Homo, right? There's just not a whole lot of difference between a lot of these specimens to really say that they should be considered distinct species, right? So for our intensive purposes here for our class, I am a lumper, right? I am not a splitter. So I look at things like Homo habilis and Homo ergaster and Homo rudolfensis. All of these, I think, are variations of the same species. All of them are Homo erectus. The only one that I would really argue or that I could see or legitimize an argument for being a different species would be Homo habilis, right? But ergaster and rudolfensis are so similar to Homo erectus that there's not much of a difference, right? If you're a splitter, on the other hand, you're going to say that all those differences, the minor differences between habilis, ergaster, and rudolfensis, are all separate species of Homo, right? So that they're each distinct rather than just really considering variation in the fossil record. So if we look at some of our earlier Homo erectus fossils, we have the Nariokotome fossil, sometimes called the Nariokotome boy. It's our earliest erectus fossil found in Africa with a cranial capacity of 900 cc's, right? So you're seeing that just in the matter of from our Australopithecines, from our jump to our Australopithecines into the genus Homo, we see a dramatic increase in brain size, right? We're getting up to, almost over double the size that we see in Australopithecines. This was found, our Nariokotome boy was found on the west side of Lake Turkana in Ethiopia. So this is just showing you the huge diversity of Homo erectus finds that we have throughout the world, right? We have Sangiran and Trinil on the island of Java. We have Zhaokoudian in China. We have Dmanisi in the country of Georgia, as well as going all the way to England in the place called Boxgrove, right? Homo erectus traveled to every single part of the planet. One interesting specimen that we found is something called the Bodo skull, which I like to refer to as a Pleistocene murder mystery. It was found in the Middle Awash Valley in Ethiopia, right? So if you look at the photo there, you can kind of see how Nariokotome was found kind of in Lake Turkana, as well as those lleret fossil footprints that you saw kind of in prior photos. But if you look in the kind of right section there, you can see Bodo, or the site of Bodo where they found the skull. And we see distinct cut marks on the cranium, right? The question that we really have is, well, were these cut marks made for some sort of burial ritual? Was it some form of murder, or was it cannibalism? So this is the original Bodo skull, and I want to kind of draw your attention to this area here where you can kind of see those striations that are going across the skull there. Those are cut marks that are made from stone tools. If we look at a microscopic image of those areas or those cut marks themselves, you can see what we call ridging, which is what occurs when you scrape flesh off of a bone, right? As you're scraping, that stone tends to gouge into the bone a little bit, and when you go to lift that off, it creates this little ridge of bone here. And it does that, sometimes if you're real rough with it, it'll do that on a level where you can actually see it, but most often, no matter how delicate you are, you'll always do that on a microscopic level. So if we look at Homo erectus in Asia, or the Asian specimens that we have, it took Homo erectus around 200,000 years moving from Africa to make it into various parts of Asia, or to kind of make it into parts of China. And Homo erectus lived in Asia all the way up until about 30,000 years ago. And what's interesting here is that, that 200,000 year period, so it's not like Homo erectus just decided one day, well, hell, I'm going to leave Africa, right? No, what was most likely happening is they were following these game animals slowly over time, right? They were following food, right? And as the food began to move through the Middle East, basically responding to climate changes and shifting food and their food patterns. So as they're moving, the Homo erectus are moving alongside them. One specimen that we have that we're actually going to come back to a couple times, because this is an area, this kind of Middle Eastern area, and that kind of Eastern European area is kind of a real heavy travel area for a lot of ancient human ancestors. One site in particular, a place called Dmanisi in Georgia. We have Asian erectus specimens that had more gracile features, right, in the skull, but definitely resembled the African erectus, right? So the earliest specimens that we find in Asia are found at this Dmanisi site in Georgia. So we've already kind of mentioned them a little bit, but I can't understate the contribution that Eugene Dubois made in terms of finding our Homo erectus and doing some of the earliest research on Homo erectus. Dubois himself was a Dutch medical doctor and an avid fossil hunter, looking for not just ancient human fossils, but all sorts of fossils. He found the Java man, which was a partial Homo erectus cranium. So in subsequent trips, he later found kind of other parts of the skeleton of our Pithecanthropus erectus or our Homo erectus or our Java man. This is a specimen that we call Sangiran 17. It dates to around 800,000 years ago. Has a cranial capacity of 1,029. So even as we're moving from Homo habilis to Homo erectus, we're seeing dramatic increases. Even in that 200,000 year period, moving from those African Homo erectuses into the Asian forms, we're seeing larger increases in cranial capacity. So one thing that we look at when we're examining cranial capacity is this notion of kind of the intracranial width or breadth, right? And that's kind of measuring the space behind the eyes here, right? And you can also take another point of measurement right here in the back, right? And what that's really saying is what we notice starting with Homo erectus is that we get this pattern where the widest point of the skull starts to shift from being down towards the base to towards the top, right? So what this is really showing is kind of as our brains or these brain cases expand, the widest part of our skull becomes more towards the top than it is at the bottom. So, in the late 1800s, paleontologists knew that the bones and teeth from prehistoric animals, such as three-toed horses and other ancient human fossils, could actually be found in Chinese pharmacies. And the reasoning behind this, and the reason why a whole lot of research wasn't done in China up until about the late 1800s, early 1900s, was because of this notion of dragon bones used in Chinese medicine, right? In Chinese medicine, they believed that fossils were actually the bones of dragons, and they would dig these fossils out of caves and quarries. So the fossils were usually collected by people in the country and sold to apothecaries, where they were ground up and sold as cures for, of course, a variety of diseases. They were believed to be the bones of dragons and thought to have magical healing properties that can cure anything from epilepsy to demonic possession. So the first kind of specimens to be coming out of the Zhaocaodian cave system near Beijing in China was the fossil specimen called the Peking Man in 1928. A man named Davidson Black, he went to China in the 1920s specifically looking for ancient human ancestors. And unfortunately, the excavations there were halted in 1937 when the Japanese invaded China. And the specimen known as the Peking Man is actually lost. We have record of it making it onto an American cruiser ship during World War II, but we have no record of it ever making it anywhere from there. So, and the cruiser ship itself wasn't sunk, so it's not like it was lost at sea. So we think what might have happened is it may have been sold out on the black market kind of right towards the end of World War II. So the Zhaocaodian cave system is a series of caves that have a lot of different bones in them. We have human ancestors as well as many other kinds of animals. There's ashes, plant remains, eggshells, garbage pits, and a whole host of different tools, right? All the animals that we find there were all extinct species, many of them variations of deer. The caves were rock shelters that served as home bases, right? And this is the first evidence of this behavior that we see in Homo erectus, right? So this is the first kind of notion of real habitation that we see happening in Homo erectus in Asia. The Zhaocaodian caves were occupied by Homo erectus from around 230,000 years ago to about 500,000 years ago. That's just the kind of archaeological layers that we have so far. And what I want you to note about the cave system in and of itself is you can see how this might be a little advantageous, right? Because no matter where you're going or how you attempt to approach the cave, you can't come down to this cave without the occupants of the cave knowing that you're coming down there, right? So it offers them kind of a little bit of protection in terms of being capable of being vigilant. So for the cave system itself, there's an early, middle, and late phase present. The tools that we find in the deepest layers are the most crude, but by the latest phase, the tools are much smaller, made of finer material. So we can actually see technological development occurring at this specific site over the course of its occupation history. Meat we know is important in the diet. We see a lot of deer and horse bones, as well as ostrich eggs, and some the plant remains that we find are fruits and berries. We know that Homo erectus probably controlled fire, but it's not known if at this point they were hunting or scavenging the meat, right? We just don't get enough or enough kind of morphology or enough definitive inferences on function from those stone tools to really say that they were hunting yet. So our Homo erectus moved into Europe a little bit later, and most likely this is due to our kind of specific evolutionary adaptations for warmer weather. So moving into Asia was most likely a little more conducive, and that's most likely the route that the game animals took, as opposed to moving up north into colder temperatures into Europe, right? So their occupation range for Europe dates from around 1.2 million years ago to around 400,000 years ago. We have two sites in northern Spain called Cima del Elefante and Grandolina. They date to around 900,000 years ago. We find animal bones with butchering marks. The specimen that you see here featured is one called Atapuerca 3. And they were kind of more like modern humans in the sense of their brain size and some of the skeletal morphology. Their features were a little more gracile. But they're pretty much kind of typical for the range of variation that we see within Homo erectus themselves. So they were bipedal tool makers, but still at this point we don't know if these guys were hunting or just scavenging. We have another specimen that's found in Mauer, Germany, right near Heidelberg. It's called the Mauer jaw, and it dates to around 500,000 years ago. And it's been kind of called a new species called Homo heidelbergensis. As a matter of fact, some people in physical anthropology will classify it as a Neanderthal. And others, if you're a lumper like myself, you're going to say that, well, this isn't really that much different from the other Homo erectuses that we find, so it's really just another Homo erectus. We also have this tibia specimen that was found in Boxgrove, England, in a quarry. Dates to around 500,000 years ago, but the dates are a little speculative. The tests were a little inconclusive, and there's little other evidence found in England other than this kind of little tibia here. So it's kind of hard, and with the ends of the bone being broken off, it's really difficult to kind of really definitively say that this is absolutely coming from an ancient human ancestor. So if we look at the diagnostic skull features of Homo erectus, we'll use our little Peking man here as an example. We have a pronounced sagittal keel. There's a large supraorbital torus, right, which is a very fancy way of saying that there is a brow ridge, right? It's very exaggerated. This is what we mean here by a brow ridge right here. Right, and then behind the brow ridge, you kind of have a dip that's known as the supraorbital sulcus. There's still a relatively low, flat forehead. We have averted nasal passages, as well as a little bit of facial prognathism. Our faces still stick out a little bit away from the rest of the skull, and you have no chin. Right, and we're going to talk about why that is a little bit later on in another recorded lecture. So the cranial shape for Homo erectus is very distinctive. It's a long and low vault, or a cranial vault with sagittal keeling. There's a nuchal torus on the back of the skull, as well as a pronounced brow ridge on the forehead. If you pick the skull up and you view it from the rear, it'll have kind of a pentagonal shape to it overall. The maximum breadth of the skull is below the ear holes near the base, as compared to modern Homo sapiens. It has thick cranial bone, as well as the presence of prominent nasal bones. So one of the questions we have is, did Homo erectus have language, right? Well, the issue really is that when we look at the cranial base of Homo erectus skulls, we notice that there's not a whole lot of room for flexion, right, or a whole lot of room for movement in the skull or movement in the neck, right? So this really suggests that they had a relatively short pharynx or a relatively short throat and could not make all the range of sounds that modern humans did. So they could have had some form of rudimentary or primitive language. We're just not, we don't really know. We don't have any way to prove it. But as far as it goes in terms of basic anatomy, they didn't have the same anatomy as modern humans, and so therefore did not have the same abilities to make the same sounds that we do as modern humans. So remember we talked about this when we talked about Homo sapien, or when we talked about kind of modern human variation on the planet, projecting noses or noses that stick far out away from the face are actually unique to Homo erectus and Homo sapiens. And your nose serves, several functions that we've already talked about in terms of inspiring air. It provides humidification as well as temperature modification, as well as when you expire air, it allows for moisture retention, right? And all of this works to create lung function or proper lung function, which occurs when air is at 100% humidity and at or close to body temperature. So Homo erectuses had smaller dentition than earlier Homo, basically, or than Homo habilis, right? So teeth are getting smaller over time. And some of the Asian specimens, this is where we start to see these shovel-shaped incisors, right? This is kind of showing kind of how when you look at the top of the tooth, it has this kind of shovel shape. And that kind of corresponds, and that's kind of a very distinctive feature in the teeth, right? And a lot of Native American people today have the same kind of shovel shaped incisors, right? It's actually a diagnostic feature that we use to determine if someone had Amerindian ancestry. So this is just showing you kind of the progression in teeth or the changes in tooth size that we see over time, starting with our Australopithecus africanus and their very large teeth, moving to our Homo habilis, who still had fairly large teeth. But as we start to move down to Homo erectus and to Homo sapiens, right, the teeth become much, much, much reduced. So how did Homo erectus really differ from earlier hominins? Well, we have an exponential increase in body size over time. The average Homo erectus height at around 1.6 million years ago for males was around 5 feet 5 inches to 5 feet 9 inches. For females, it was 5 feet to around 5 feet 6 inches. So what you're seeing here is this is really close to modern human heights, right? It's just a little bit shorter than the average heights that there are today, right? So really, Homo erectus is apart from the brain size, is all the postcrania, the rest of the skeleton is fairly human. So really, something that we're going to talk about in a little more detail, why do we really have this increase in body size steadily over time, right? Starting kind of with our little Homo habilis and moving through our Homo erectus, right? Body sizes begin to increase as well as brain size. Well, one of the explanations, or the one that I kind of hold the most stock and validity into, is this notion that must have been some big change in diet, right? So being able to incorporate higher quality fats, proteins, and lipids into your diet allows for larger body growth. So if we look at kind of the evidence for the importance of meat in the diet of Homo erectus, these Acheulean hand axes and these cleavers essentially became the tools for Homo erectus, right? Wear patterns on them in experimental studies suggest they were best used for dismembering and butchering large animal carcasses. So Homo erectus people were, essentially big and robust, right? There must have been a dietary change that allowed for this increase in body size. It was an increase in body size of over 1/3 than we see in earlier Homo species. So by 1.6 million years ago, at least one of the major sites we use as evidence is this place called Lorgasali. By 1.6 million years ago, Acheulean tools are firmly cemented as the kind of technological tool type for Homo erectus, right? It's clear that early Homo erectus was hunting and killing game, at least at this Lorgasali site. And this led to an increase in the high quality proteins and lipids within the diet overall. And you can see here, based on all of these kind of different zones here, Homo erectus made tools no matter where they were at. If we're looking at the Acheulean tradition, right, that's kind of Europe and Africa and the Middle East. When they move a little bit north, some of the materials are a little bit harder to find, so they're kind of using whatever they can find. And then you have a little bit of a more primitive tool system that we see happening in Asia. But over time, those tool systems become more complex, right? So we know that by 1.6 million years ago, Homo erectus was on the verge of becoming a relatively regular group hunter. One of the quandaries that we come across when looking at the fossil record is how do we prove when, when Homo erectus was hunting these large game animals and butchering them, were they actually eating the meat raw or were they cooking them, right? And so cooking itself is extremely difficult to prove, but we have evidence at Homo erectus sites that they had controlled use of fire, right? And cooked meat provides the kind of nutrition needed or kind of reorients those proteins in a way that allows the kind of brain to better utilize it for nutrition. So we do find some of the evidence that we find, we'll talk about it, is, things like ash layers and burnt animal bone and things like that. So cooking in and of itself requires two basic fundamental evolutionary adaptations, right? You have controlled use of fire, right, which is kind of self-explanatory, but you also have cooperative behavior, right, because somebody needs to sit there and tend that fire and keep it going while the others are kind of preparing to cook the food, right? Someone needs to be that cook. So that person or that individual may not necessarily be out hunting, right? They may actually be at the home base kind of keeping the fire going. So meats provide three kind of basic things that your brain loves to eat: proteins, lipids, and sugars. And it's kind of really this increase in the quality of these items, apart from what we get in just regular kind of vegetation, which, you'll get some protein in vegetation, and yes, you will get some plant or kind of plant-based fats as well as some sugars, but there's kind of a difference in the way the body processes them in terms of how it uses them, right? The sugars that you get from plants are kind of a little more readily burnable than the sugars that are provided through kind of muscle tissue and things like that. So it's really kind of the increase in the quality of the proteins, lipids, and sugars that we were ingesting, or Homo erectus was ingesting in their diet, that really led to the increase in body size as well as brain size. So in essence, what we're seeing here in terms of overall patterns, and this to me, as being someone who studies kind of paleo nutrition, is kind of one of the more fascinating things about our evolutionary history, right? So what we're seeing here is a creation of a positive evolutionary feedback loop, right? So as you are hunting and cooking plants, you're obtaining a higher quality diet, which leads to larger brains, which leads to more effective stone tools, right? So what we're seeing here is, as your stone tool industry, and this is, follows the pattern that we see, because over time, once hunting becomes firmly cemented as a cultural and dietary practice, we start to see those tool forms become more refined, better developed, right? We start to see brain size getting larger at an exponential rate. We start to see body sizes getting larger at an exponential rate. So it's really that feedback loop, right? Cooking and hunting and getting that better quality food, higher quality diet leads to larger brains, which leads to better production of stone tools. So one of the kind of earliest things that we look for in terms of the recognition of true culture, there are two distinct kind of behavioral features we're looking for. Purposeful burials, where some sort of rite or ritual was done, where the body was kind of taken care of after death and buried on purpose. And the other thing we look for is some form of aesthetic, right? Some form of artwork. What we're seeing here is the potential beginnings of culture. There's a 430,000-year-old shell that may have been engraved by Homo erectus that was originally excavated by Eugene Dubois in the 1890s, but it was actually only recently discovered in 2014, right? Because it essentially sat on a shelf in a museum in a box for over 100 years. So this is showing you kind of the engraving that's on that shell, right? And you can kind of notice this distinct zigzag pattern. And the issue is that, and the right reason why researchers think that this might be your earliest kind of evidence of art is that there's really no way to reconstruct that patterning by any natural means. So if we look at some of the other theories behind the development of the genus Homo, there's quite a few that exist. And remember that there are large gaps in the evolutionary specimen record, right? So some believe Homo habilis is not even a direct ancestor. But to look at a couple of these, we have Dan Lieberman's thermoregulation theory. Dan Lieberman comes from Harvard. Of course, we have good old big Grandpappy Darwin that came up with the big game hunting theory. And then we also have Diane Swanbro coming up with the Big Bang theory for the development of the genus Homo. So Lieberman's theory he developed after gauging energy expenditure between bipeds and quadrupeds. So and his theory concludes, or his research concluded, that bipedality is more energy efficient than quadruped or quadrupedalism. So thermoregulation fits more for the development of upright running rather than for the development of bipedalism overall. So it really fits for the development of the genus Homo, not for the development of bipedality, right? Because really it's the genus Homo where we start to see our first kind of overall marathon runners. So in terms of Darwin's big game hunting theory, he says that the genus Homo arose due to a selective force derived from hunting big game animals. This coincides nice with that masticatory functional hypothesis, but this really does not account for the loss of body hair in humans. Lieberman's thermoregulation theory actually does account for the loss in body hair. He's saying that as our bipedal movement became more efficient, we became marathon runners, that we began to lose that body hair because we no longer needed it for thermoregulation. So if we look at Swansbro's Big Bang theory, it's basically saying that the genus Homo arose from a bottleneck of Homo habilis populations, right? Whether it was due to disease or, as she claims, through climate change. So out of that bottleneck of populations, only those most efficient in hunting and bipedal movement survived, right? So she's really saying that's what led to the development of Homo erectus. And it does coincide well with kind of the notions of how the climate was rapidly changing at that time. So in essence, the question is, well, where do we go from here? Well, if we look at these Atapuerca specimens from the Cima de los Huesos site in Spain, otherwise known as the Pit of Bones, which is one of the largest fossil hominid samples ever recovered from one locality. It's a very large cave that has at least 33 ancient human specimens and many, many bear fossils as well. There's no herbivore bones. There's no entrance other than a vertical shaft, right? So we really think that these individuals may have just been dumped there because they died and those bears were there as well. Or conversely, the bears may have been able to get in and out of there and drag the humans down there. But the individuals that we see here have a mosaic of erectine and Neanderthal traits. So what we're going to start to see from here is that we're going to start to see changes that occur in these various Homo erectus populations throughout the world, right? Some of them develop into this interesting class of creatures called Homo neanderthalensis. Some of them kind of remain relatively stable in terms of their morphology. If we look at the Asian specimens, that's why they existed in Asia up to about 30,000 years ago, long after Homo sapiens are already around. So it's really going to be the different responses that these Homo erectus populations have to the varying climatic conditions in these different parts of the world that's really going to spur that morphological change. And it's also a degree of it is related to sexual selection as well, right? Because a lot of these species, Homo erectus, even Homo sapiens, as well as Homo neanderthalensis, were all capable of interbreeding with one another. So one wave of migration out of Africa is that proposed taxon Homo heidelbergensis, but for our purposes, we're going to call them Homo erectus, around 800 to 400,000 years ago. And these, by some taxonomists, are probably kind of the ancestors to our what we call our Neanderthals. So if we look at kind of language development, this is kind of right about the time where we would start to really look. When we start to see cooperative hunting, we start to see larger brain sizes. This is really the period of time that a lot of researchers focus on trying to discover the origins of language, right? So the reorganization of neurological structures permitted the development of language. At some point, communication had to have become increasingly important during human evolution, and natural selection would have favored anatomical and neurological changes that enhanced our ancestors' ability to use spoken language, right? So it's most likely that those early hominids were already predisposed to language development. They were really just waiting for that kind of cooperative hunting and some of those technological developments to kind of really kick it off and really get it into development. So there are many contending theories as to when language developed. If we look at Noam Chomsky, who's one of the prominent linguists today, he would say it was at or about 100,000 years ago. Some geneticists believe that the FOXP2 gene is what diverged Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis, right? And that FOXP2 gene is what really allowed for those neurological structures that we have today that allowed for language production. But no one really knows, and likely it will never be proven for sure. So this is just showing you one of our Homo neanderthalensis, or otherwise known as our Neanderthals. It's an early kind of human, but not a direct ancestor. Changes in European populations of Homo erectus probably led to a lineage that was ancestral to our Neanderthals. So it's not until we really get to these Neanderthals that we have our real earliest beginnings of true culture that we can really measure. We know that they were able to speak. They have a flexed cranial base and a modern-looking hyoid bone, so they have all of the physical apparatus required to speak, just like modern humans do. And we know that they buried their dead and cared for their elderly as well as their handicapped, right? So these Neanderthals are really the kind of first in our lineage that we see true beginnings of culture.